Welcome back to Why We Are Christians. We are joined by Brian Bailey today. I'm Katrina Pierce, and we're going to continue on our conversation. If you haven't caught our first half, please look that up as well, because we kind of get started to get to know Brian in that part, and now we're picking up from where we left off there. And the last thing we talked about was college and where you went to college in Florida, and you were majored in education,
Right.
and after college,
I left for a year. I went up and taught in Georgia for a year and then returned to Tallahassee.
have you been married during that time, or
Yes, I was.
you were married? When
Yes.
did you meet your wife? Was that during
At
college?
FSU. At FSU.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
That was, and you moved her up with you to Georgia?
Right. We both actually went up there and taught, and she taught science and I taught social studies. As it turns out, even though her education major was early childhood ed, they were quite willing to keep her and certify her, but they wouldn't certify me, so we didn't have much of a choice.
Some of your faith. Was your wife, did she share your faith? Did you share that together?
She did. She did. Share the faith, and so we never had issues per se there. Other problems arose later on due to difficult events in our lives that really the fallout from it was just insurmountable.
Even though you both had that strong faith, it was sometimes things in your life are just so traumatic that
Right,
it
right.
definitely it
Had an automobile accident and our son was killed.
I'm very
And
sorry.
that was a very, very difficult time. And for a variety of reasons, some of it related to the accident, some of it just some other issues that were more inbred in the marriage, so to speak. Ultimately, we separated and divorced. The divorce was extremely together, but and all things being equal, that is the case. However, for a marriage to survive, both people have to be willing to invest in it wholeheartedly and
Right.
do the necessary relational work to keep a relationship alive and healthy and happy. And if you're not able to do that, the fractures can be too great, and the marriages sometimes cannot survive that. And if you go through a divorce, you have a lot of conflicting emotions that bubble up because of that. A lot of people, I know for myself, deal with feelings of failure and, why couldn't I make this thing work, so on and so forth. And
And that's typical. I think most people probably have those emotions, but
Ultimately happened through all of it is I began to understand more the depth of God's love and forgiveness and compassion. A lot of us, if when we grow up in the church, can be prone to looking in our lives and developing some sense of pride that I've got this thing all licked. I mean, we would never really probably verbally say that and may not even recognize it in ourselves, but that might be back there in the back of our mind. And when all of a sudden you have something like a divorce come up, you realize I need help. I still need God's grace desperately in my life because I can't do this on my own strength. A broken creature who is being redeemed. Well, I didn't always handle it well. There were times where I was sorely tempted just to kind of go my own way for a bit because I just didn't like the sense of, of failure that I was dealing with. And you know, it was not a case where either one of us had been unfaithful or anything like that. It was not that. It was just that with everything that had happened in the loss of Charles and some other longstanding issues, we just Humpty Dumpty had fallen off the wall and we just couldn't put him back together.
did you blame God? Were you angry with him? I know.
No, I wasn't angry. I blamed myself more than anything. I was more prone to internalize it and what ultimately helped me work through it was the sense of coming to the place where I could truly see, not just with my head, but with my heart, that God loves me and that He does not expect me to be a sinless human being. Yes, He came to earth to recreate us and to make us into the image of Christ. That's what He's doing in our lives. But the divorce did not take God by surprise. And God still loved me even though this had happened and I felt like a great failure. I came to the place where I understood God loved me regardless, and He was committed to me and was committed to help me work through it and to use it to work out and build His character in my life.
It sounds
I
like
wouldn't
that
want
was
to
pretty
go. I
comforting.
wouldn't want to go through it again. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. No, that's an excruciating time, I'm sure. And anyway, let's move on from a very heavy topic. And you have you are currently married for
Yes,
20 years.
19 years.
19 years. So congratulations on that. That's quite a good time. So you have been able to, life does go on, and He's picked you up
Yeah.
and led you somewhere where you feel that you are exactly where you should be, and you and your wife are in a good place. And
Yes, yes.
do you?
I mean, you know, we have struggles in terms of we're older. You know, we're not as young as we used to be, so consequently we have the issues that just result from getting older and our aches and pains and so forth. But we just try to love each other and be there for each other and give each other support.
Are you able to both encourage each other in your faith? Is that something that you
Yes,
support each other
yes,
on?
yes,
That's
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
was that important to you? I mean, in remarrying, was that a key in finding someone to commit your life to, or did that come later?
Yes and no. It was there to a degree but I was still spiritually healing. And so I still, God has developed that in our marriage more over time. I was very fortunate in that God graciously, I tell you that for guys out there, the secret is marrying up.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, find somebody that's better than you are, and someone that loves you regardless. That's the critical thing. And I have a delightful extended family in Anna's family. Just a great bunch of folks, and we have a lot of fun together. And they've always been very warm and gracious and loving to me. So I'm very thankful for that.
Nice. That's good. That's great to hear, and that's encouraging to people that might be trying to only look at a certain, through a certain small hole of. I know sometimes people are open to exploring and deepening their faith, but sometimes it takes another step, or
Right.
going through something, or just being with someone who has that strength to kind of pull it out. So anyway, that's thanks for sharing that. I also want to talk about the book that you just recently wrote. I know you've written a few things, and this book that you just wrote is Joseph, and this is about the story of Joseph's life, and that you've pulled different stories and things through your reading of the Bible, and kind of put them all together to give a full and complete story of him. Would you give us a little taste of what the book is like?
Sure. The book is more of a biographical sketch than it is a straight exegesis of all the chapters that deal with the story of Joseph directly. By that I mean Joseph's life we essentially see starting in Genesis chapter 37 and going through chapter 50. And I touch on the pertinent material in those chapters, but I don't have a straight exegesis of every verse in that range of chapters, because what I wanted to do was frame his life in three particular areas that I think are important for us as we look at the Bible today. People, when they look at the Bible, the first question that might come to mind is, okay, I'm looking at a book here that was written by people barely into the Iron Age. In Joseph's case, his life is 40 centuries removed from our own. What can he tell us about life? What can we learn from him? Well, and the point is we can learn a great deal, because as Solomon told us, there's nothing new under the sun. Human nature has not changed from the time of Joseph. He had issues that many people can relate to in their lives.
Can you give us an example of one that?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
He had enormous family of origin issues that really, really powerfully impacted his life. He was from essentially a blended family. He had, at the time he was born, 10 other siblings that were from 3 other women. So you've got a family dynamic where there's automatically a lot of competition for the attention and the affection of their father. He's born in his father Jacob's old age, and he becomes Jacob's favorite child. And not only is he the favorite child, Jacob is not careful to shield that from anybody. It's very obvious to his brothers that Joseph is preferred and favored over them, and so that creates a tremendous amount of anger and jealousy in the family that ultimately is going to impact his life in ways that he would have never suspected.
Sure. That definitely can resemble some blended families today.
Yeah.
So
Well, we
it's
all have family of origin issues to some degree or another. That's
sure.
just, we are sinful, fallen creatures, and people sin often the most against those that are immediately around them. And so he went through that. He had a difficult family life. Bluntly, by the time the events that we look at in Genesis 37 transpired, his brothers hated him. They were ready to kill him.
So
So,
so
not a
it's
good dynamic.
no, 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 but it's also, I know we're always, told to speak to our elders, listen to the stories, and learn from experience of other
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
And that's something that it's difficult for youth today or of any generation to do. But it's stems so far back as to stories from the Bible that are from the beginning of time, basically, that you can read and learn from. It's
Right.
there. And without getting into, you don't have to get into all of the other faith questions. If you just want to read for historical sense, you can do that. Just to kind of, it's just something that might draw people to, just open up and read. I know sometimes reading the Bible can be very intimidating as you think of it as a whole. But if you pick out a story or pick out, as you did, Joseph, and just learn from, little bits and pieces like that, and see how similar, like you said, human character
Yeah.
still remains very similar.
Yeah. People have
So
not changed.
it's very interesting. So so what was probably the most interesting thing that in Joseph's life that that might make people want to read more about him? What would be the most interesting thing that you learned while writing this book?
The interesting thing about Joseph is that the way Joseph chose to respond to life, I think, is very instructive for us as Christians. You stop and think about this. He's betrayed by his brothers. He's sold into slavery. He goes down to Egypt. He is then sold to a new owner. He comes into this man's household, probably knew nothing about the language that he was going into, certainly probably very little about the culture. And Joseph, what he does is that instead of sitting and sulking and, at least insofar as we know, saying, "Oh, woe is me, my life is terrible, my life's over, I might as well die." I'm sure that Joseph probably had time where he dealt with depression, but the fact of the matter is, what he did is that he responded by saying, "Okay, here I am. I'm working for this man. My father taught me how to work. I'll get to work. I'll just do the best I can where I am and leave the results up to God." And that's exactly what Joseph did. And he does that, but then the event happens where his owner's wife decides that she fancies him. He rebuffs her advances. She falsely accuses him of rape, and he ends up in prison. So he's done nothing wrong. He's all he's done was try to do what was responsible, And here he is now. He's taken a giant step backwards. What does he do? He says, okay, I'm here. I might as well as get to work and do what I know I'm supposed to do, and I'll have to leave this up to God. And so he does this, and we don't know exactly how long he was in prison, but we know he was there at least 2 years, wow. Certainly probably longer. And then one day, Joseph wakes up. He's a prisoner. By nightfall, he's the second most powerful man in what is then the most powerful country in the ancient world. It's a fascinating story.
I guess we have to read it to find out how that happened.
Yeah. So, Joseph was a man who, wherever God put him, he chose to do what he knew he was supposed to do, regardless of his immediate circumstances. I was thinking about this earlier. Joseph's path to greatness was through service. That is not how we think of it in our Western culture. But in God's economy, that is often how people are raised up in the ultimate scheme of things in the kingdom of God. People are raised up by being servants and by being faithful where God has them at the moment.
How do you think that translates to people today?
Well, I think it translates this way. We cannot choose all of the events in our lives. Some events come into our lives that are greater than we are, that we simply are impacted by. For example, Joseph had no control over what Potiphar or his owner's wife did. But all of a sudden, she does him very wrong and he's in jail. What we can choose to do in our lives is say, God, what does faithfulness look like to you right now? What does obedience to you look like in this situation? Help me to do what is pleasing in your sight insofar as it has been revealed to me now where I am today. And I think that is a critical piece for it today. I was thinking about, there was a gentleman, he's passed away now. He was a Catholic priest who taught at Harvard. He was a great writer. His name was Henry Nouwen. And he had been teaching at Harvard and felt God called him out of the teaching and publishing world to go work at a community that dealt with the needs of the physically and mentally handicapped. And so the last 10 years of his life, this man who had achieved great success in terms of the worldly ideal in Christian work, and a lot of people said, Henry, you're throwing yourself away. But what he did is he went into this community, and for 10 years, he physically cared for a man who was physically and mentally impaired, because he felt that's what God called him to do, was to serve this young man in this situation.
Brian, do you have a final thought for us?
Yes. I would say, too, that when we consider the life of Joseph, the title of the book is Joseph, A Life of Providence, Injustice, and Forgiveness. The overarching theme in the life of Joseph is the providence of God. That is, God actively working out his plan in the life of Joseph, not only for Joseph, but also for the history of the people of Israel, and ultimately for the redemption of mankind in Jesus Christ. It is all part of the same story, what some writers call the scarlet thread of redemption. Joseph plays a very major part in that. You know, you ask the question, how can Joseph's life apply to ours today? Mm-hmm. And it is simply this, and we've hinted around this. Joseph suffered great injustice from his brothers. He suffered injustice at the hands of his owner's wife, Potiphar's wife. He suffered injustice in being imprisoned, and then when he helped a fellow prisoner out, he was simply forgotten about for a 2-year period. So he dealt with injustice, and many people in their lives also deal with that. So his life can be instructive for us in dealing with any of the injustices that we face. And along with that is that regardless in our lives as to whether we face injustice or not, all of us in our lives ultimately are going to deal with the issue of forgiveness. And as much as anything, the story of Joseph's life is a story of a man's journey into forgiveness. He had much to forgive. His brothers had treated him abominably, wanted him dead. And he had to learn how to deal with his past and his brothers so that he could be a part of the future that God had for his people. So all of us in life have to deal with forgiveness. And Joseph's life has truth in there that we can take and look at and will help us with ours as well. The Bible is not meant to be a self-help book. We're not trying to say that, but we're saying that his journey and our journey in life, even though we're removed by many centuries, our journeys are often very similar, and people in the scriptures often face the same issues that we do, and so they can help lead us and guide us in our faith and give us a roadmap for our futures.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your insights and thoughts with us and your life. It was an honor talking with you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us and Why We Are Christians. Thank you so much. I hope you'll tune in again. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Y'all have a good evening.